Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the survey of medieval church history. We left off last time with the death of Pope Honorius IV on April 3rd, 1287. This video will cover the reign of Pope 191, Pope Nicholas IV. When Honorius died in 1287, 16 cardinals were eligible to vote. 6 of the cardinals died during the conclave of a contagious fever, along with many others in the city. So the rest of the cardinals evacuated the city before electing a new pope. 7 of them reassembled 10 months later, reconvening on February 15th, 1288, at the late Pope's residence, the Savelli Palace, near Santa Sabina in Rome, on the Aventine Hill. They chose the Cardinal Bishop of Palestrina, named Girolamo Masci, M-A-S-C-I. He took the papal name Nicholas IV. He was the first Franciscan to become pope. Born on September 30th, 1227, in Liciano, Italy, he joined the Franciscans, where he found a congenial home for his piety, which was both practical and devotional. In 1272, he was appointed provincial of the Dalmatian province. That's on the eastern side of the Adriatic Sea. So, Italy here, and then across the Adriatic, what used to be Yugoslavia, see Bosnia-Herzegovina, that area there, that was just called the Dalmatian coast. So that's where he was provincial. 2 years later, in 1274, he succeeded Saint Bonaventure as superior general of the Franciscans. After we covered earlier in the course, Saint Bonaventure died at the Second Council of Lyon in 1274. Masci proved to have a facility with languages, so was employed by successive popes on diplomatic missions to Constantinople and to France. As a reward for his service, he was appointed Cardinal Bishop of Palestrina in 1279, in which capacity he attended the conclave of 1288 following the death of Honorius IV. He was widely respected for his lack of involvement in high ecclesiastical politics of the previous decades. He received a majority of the votes on February 15th as a compromise candidate, but he refused election as he felt himself ill-prepared for dealing with the infinitely complex situation of the Holy See embedded in the web of feudalism. So the conclave dragged on for 7 more months, with no one receiving sufficient votes, until he was reelected on February 22nd, and he accepted rather than allow an indefinite, interminable sede vacante. So he reigned as Pope 191 for 4 years and 2 months, with the papal name Nicholas IV. He had always dreamed of being a missionary, but the church had made different use of his abilities. As Pope, he thought to serve the missionary heritage of the church, even if he could not join personally. The Republic of Venice had funded an overland trading venture to China, led by Niccolo and Maffeo Polo, P-O-L-O. They were the father and uncle of the more famous Marco Polo. In 1269, they returned to Venice with news that China was ruled not by the Chinese, not by Han Chinese, but by Kublai Khan, who was a Mongol. Mongolia is well, north of China. So Mongolia is north of China, and the Mongols, it's here. It's a completely different ethnic group, different language, different history from the Han Chinese. So here, see here's China, and then Mongolia is to the north. So the Mongols. The Great Wall of China was built to keep them out, and did not always work. So the Mongols conquered China, and Kublai Khan was the ruler of China. Now, since he was a foreigner, so to speak, in China, he was open to other non-Chinese coming to China, which was China's one of China's openings to the West, which is not something that was characteristic of its history when it was controlled by Han Chinese, but in this case it was. So with this news, in 1289, the year after he became Pope, Nicholas IV dispatched a missionary group to China, led by an Italian Franciscan named Giovanni de Montecorvino. He discovered, when he got to China, that the Chinese already knew of Christianity. They already had Christians living in China, but it was a heretical form of Christianity that developed in antiquity in the Persian sphere, Persia and Mesopotamia. This was Nestorian Christianity. The Nestorians denied the divinity of Christ. So Nestorian Christians fled Persia after it was conquered by Islam and converted to Islam, and they settled in China. Corvino succeeded in establishing the true faith in China, eventually being named bishop of what they were calling Peking, now is Beijing, and he was named Patriarch of the Orient. He long outlived Pope Nicholas, but more than justified his support. Corvino established 4 mission stations in China, 3 of them in Beijing and 1 on the coast, opposite the island of Formosa, which is now Taiwan. He recorded 6,000 baptisms in his 39-year mission in China. It was the misfortune of the Church that this missionary enterprise had taken place under the favor of Mongol rulers, who were foreign conquerors in the eyes of the Chinese, and therefore despised by the Chinese. The indigenous resistance to the Mongol occupation was led by the people who became the Ming dynasty, which overthrew the Mongols in 1368 and expelled all foreigners from China, including Christians, the following year. Pope Nicholas, initially, one of the reasons he refused papal election, and the first time he was offered, was the duties of governance that fell on the Pope. Specifically, Nicholas was aware that the Church had become drawn into the morass of dynastic marriages and political alliances that characterized feudalism. One problem he inherited, which we've seen over the several reigns, was the problem of Naples and Sicily. We already covered that in previous videos, so I won't repeat it all. In 1288, Nicholas becomes involved in this problem. Of course, he wanted nothing to do with it, but he couldn't ignore it because the territory of Naples was, the northern border of Naples was the southern border of the Holy See, of the Papal State. Nicholas had many French contacts, dating as far back as his attendance at the Second Council of Lyon in 1274, as well as from diplomatic missions he carried out to France on behalf of Nicholas III. He actively mistrusted the Germans because he knew, the history of what the Hohenstaufens had done. Now, he knew nothing about the House of Jimenez from Aragon, who was, Peter was dead. Peter III of Aragon was dead. He became king of Sicily through his wife's claim, and then his younger son James, was reigning as king of Sicily. But Nicholas had never had any contact with him, didn't know him. So Nicholas backed the French claim, the French House of Anjou. Charles of Anjou was dead, so he was still backing the French claim put forward by Charles de Valois, who was also related to the royal family, and declared the French the rightful rulers of both Naples and Sicily on May 29th, 1289. This earned Nicholas the everlasting hatred of southern Italians and Sicilians, who regarded the Holy See now, with an Italian pope, as placing the foreign interest ahead of their own. This is one example of a myriad of political entanglements which continuously distracted the popes of the period, very much against their will, because of the integration of the church into the political structure of feudalism. Never forget that the average Catholic had no idea of all the pressures inflicted on the Holy See and what the popes had to do in order to maintain the independence of the church. All the average Catholic heard was, the popes involved in politics, the church is political. So remember this in coming to terms why so many Catholics turned on the church during the Renaissance and then later during the Protestant movement. Also during the reign of Pope Nicholas, history changed. And it would be fair to say that the medieval period ended during his reign on May 28th, 1291. On that date, the city of Acre, which is now Akko in present-day Israel, that was the last Christian-held city in the Holy Land. It fell on May 28th, 1291. It was reconquered by Muslims. All the military orders were present for its defense. 14,800 military brothers were there. Most chose to fight to the death. Less than 500 survived and escaped to the island of Cyprus. The brethren who stayed to defend Acre were the best members of the orders, the most committed, the ones who were really the idealists, dedicated to the crusading cause. The prestige of the papacy and the faith of medieval man was shattered by the fall, now the undeniable fall of the Holy Land to Muslims for the second time. When it had previously been captured by Islam in 638, it had been taken from Greek Christians, Byzantine Christians, whom the West regarded as weak and schismatic, at least schismatic since 1054. But this time in 1291, the land of Christ was lost to Muslims when defended by Catholic knights, Western Catholic knights. This filled the medieval mind with doubts and a terrible fear that God had abandoned them. This fear and doubt introduced a contradiction into the medieval worldview. Either it was God's will that the land of Christ be lost to Islam, which made no sense to Christians. Or they had been misled about the true nature of God's will by churchmen. This shadow of doubt created ready minds to listen to the later arguments of university scholars and Protestant writers who challenged the authority of the church. Another consequence, the loss of the Holy Land deprived the military religious orders of their reason for existence. Recall that it was a fairly new vocation in terms of church history. At this point, it was just, almost 11, 12, it's not quite 300 years old. And it had combined two previously separate callings. They were vowed religious who lived out their work for the kingdom of God as lifelong professional soldiers. Now, there were many of these orders. The Templars and the Hospitallers were only the most famous, but there were others. Some larger and more important than others, but they all had been richly endowed by the faithful in the West, both noble and commoners, who shared the belief that the Holy Land must be in Christian hands. The loss of the Holy Land not only led to inevitable questions about the integrity and dedication of the orders, but also left the orders in Europe, they all had houses, many houses in Europe, left them in possession of vast holdings in Europe which now were not able to be used for the purpose for which they had been donated. For his part, Pope Nicholas IV attempted to summon another crusade in 1291. He wasn't, disposed to accept that as permanent, that Christian, that there was no longer a Christian outpost in the Holy Land. It was going to go, have another crusade. He even created a navy of 40 ships to support the endeavor. He contemplated forcibly uniting the military orders into one, just one, uber, meta religious military order, because it was believed, I think correctly, that the rivalry between these orders, the military orders, had contributed to their failure to defend the Holy Land. But in the end, there simply, in 1291, there was just no interest in Europe for another crusade. And Nicholas was told, informed privately, that if he ordered a unification of the military orders, he had no way to enforce it, and they probably would refuse. I mean, imagine trying to force the German Teutonic Knights into the same order with the French Templars. It wouldn't work. So rather than risk the orders publicly repudiating papal authority, he just accepted the loss of the Holy Land as either permanent or at least it would endure through his life. The failure of a cause so closely associated with the papacy could not help but evolve in the public mind into a failure of the papacy itself. Nicholas died on April 4th, 1292, 11 months after the fall of Acre and the fall of the Holy Land. He was followed as Pope 192 by St. Celestine V. So we'll cover him in the next video, but for now, an argument could be made that the fall of Acre in 1291 would be a legitimate ending for the medieval period. But because it's so close to the turn of the century, I'm just going to continue. I'm going to finish out the 13th century. And the last pope elected in the 13th century lived for 3 years into the 14th. It's Boniface VIII. So I'll go through, and conclude there, and then start the modern playlist. Currently the modern playlist starts at 1500. But when I get around to it, I'll fill in and start it with 1300. Anyway, so the next video will be on Pope 192, Celestine V. For now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.